Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog, by Jerome K. Jerome. Today's readings, chapters 5 through 8. Chapter 5. Mrs. P. arouses us. George, the sluggard. The weather forecast swindle. Our luggage. Depravity of the small boy. The people gather round us. We drive off in great style and arrive at Waterloo. Innocence of southwestern officials concerning such worldly things as trains. We are afloat in an open boat. It was Mrs. Poppets that woke me up the next morning. She said, "Do you know that it's nearly 9 o'clock, sir?" 9 what?" I cried, standing up. 9 o'clock, she replied, through the keyhole. "I thought you was oversleeping yourselves." I woke Harris and told him. He said, "I thought you wanted us to get up at 6. "So I did," I answered. "Why didn't you wake me?" "How could I wake you when you didn't wake me?" he retorted. "Now we shan't get on the water till after 12. I wonder you take the trouble to get up at all." I replied, "lucky for you that I do. If I hadn't woke you, you'd have lain there for the whole fortnight." We snarled at one another in this strain for the next few minutes, when we were interrupted by a defiant snore from George. It reminded us, for the first time since our being called, of his existence. There he lay, the man who had wanted to know what time he should wake us, on his back, with his mouth wide open and his knees stuck up. I don't know why it should be, I am sure, but the sight of another man asleep in bed when I am up maddens me. It seems to me so shocking to see the precious hours of a man's life, the priceless moments that will never come back to him again, being wasted in mere brutish sleep. There was George, throwing away in hideous sloth the inestimable gift of time, his valuable life, every second of which he would have to account for hereafter, passing away from him, unused. He might have been up stuffing himself with eggs and bacon, irritating the dog, or flirting with the slavey, instead of sprawling there, sunk in soul-clogging oblivion. It was a terrible thought. Harris and I appeared to be struck by it at the same instant. We determined to save him in this noble resolve. Our own dispute was forgotten. We flew across and slung the clothes off him, and Harris landed him one with a slipper, and I shouted in his ear, and he awoke. "What's the matter?" he observed, sitting up. "Get up, you fat-headed chunk," roared Harris. "It's 9:45. "What?" he shrieked, jumping out of bed into the bath. "Who the thunder put this thing here?" We told him he must have been a fool not to see the bath. We finished dressing, and when it came to extras, we remembered that we had packed the toothbrushes and the brush and comb. That toothbrush of mine will be the death of me, I know. And we had to go downstairs and fish them out of the bag. And when we had done that, George wanted the shaving tackle. We told him he would have to go without shaving that morning, as we weren't going to unpack that bag again for him, nor for anyone like him. He said, "Don't be absurd. How can I go into the city like this?" It was certainly rather rough on the city, but what cared we for human suffering? As Harris said, in his common vulgar way, the city would have to lump it. We went downstairs to breakfast. Montmorency had invited 2 other dogs to come and see him off, and they were whiling away the time by fighting on the doorstep. We calmed them with an umbrella and sat down to chops and cold beef. Harris said, "The great thing is to make a good breakfast," and he started with a couple of chops, saying that he could take these while they were hot, as the beef could wait. George got hold of the paper and read us out the boating fatalities and the weather forecast, which later prophesied rain, cold, wet to fine, whatever more than usually ghastly thing in the weather that may be. Occasional local thunderstorms, east wind, with general depression over the Midland counties, London and Channel, barometer falling. I do think that, of all the silly, irritating tomfoolishness by which we are plagued, this weather forecast fraud is about the most aggravating. It forecasts precisely what happened yesterday, or the day before, and precisely the opposite of what is going to happen today. I remember a holiday of mine being completely ruined one late autumn by our paying attention to the weather report of the local newspaper. Heavy showers with thunderstorms may be expected today, it would say on Monday, and so we would give up our picnic and stop indoors all day, waiting for the rain. And people would pass the house, going off in wagonettes and coaches as jolly and merry as could be, the sun shining out and not a cloud to be seen. "Ah," we said, as we stood looking out at them through the window, "won't they come home soaked?" And we chuckled to think how wet they were going to get, and came back and stirred the fire, and got our books, and arranged our specimens of seaweed and cockleshells. By 12 o'clock, with the sun pouring into the room, the heat became quite oppressive, and we wondered when those heavy showers and occasional thunderstorms were going to begin. "Ah, they'll come in the afternoon, you'll find," we said to each other. "Oh, won't those people get wet? What a lark." At 1 o'clock, the landlady would come in and ask if we weren't going out, as it seemed such a lovely day. "No, no," we replied, with a knowing chuckle. "Not we. We don't mean to get wet. No, no." And when the afternoon was nearly gone, and still there was no sign of rain, we tried to cheer ourselves up with the idea that it would come down all at once, just as the people had started for home and were out of reach of any shelter, and they would thus get more drenched than ever. But not a drop ever fell, and it finished a grand day and a lovely night after it. The next morning, we would read that it was going to be a warm, fine, to set fair day, much heat, and we would dress ourselves in flimsy things and go out, and half an hour after we started, it would commence to rain hard, and a bitterly cold wind would spring up, and both would keep on steadily for the whole day. We would come home with colds and rheumatism all over us, and go to bed. The weather's a thing that is beyond me altogether. I can never understand it. The barometer is useless. It is as misleading as the newspaper forecast. There was one hanging up in a hotel at Oxford, which I was staying last spring, and when I got there, it was pointing to set fair. It was simply pouring with rain outside, and had been all day, and I couldn't quite make matters out. I tapped the barometer, and it jumped up and pointed to very dry. The boot stopped me as he was passing, and said he expected it meant tomorrow. I fancied that maybe it was thinking of the week before last, but Boots said no, he thought not. I tapped it again the next morning, and it went up still higher, and the rain came down faster than ever. On Wednesday, I went and hit it again, and the pointer went round towards set fair, very dry, and much heat, until it was stopped by the peg and couldn't go any further. It tried its best, but the instrument was built so that it couldn't prophesy fine weather any harder than it did without breaking itself. It evidently wanted to go on and prognosticate drought, and water famine, and sunstroke, and samooms, and such things, but the peg prevented it, and it had to be content with pointing to the mere commonplace, very dry. Meanwhile, the rain came down in a steady torrent, and the lower part of the town was under water, owing to the river having overflowed. Boots said it was evident they were going to have a prolonged spell of grand weather some time, and read out a poem which was printed over the top of the Oracle about long foretold, long last, short notice soon past. The fine weather never came that summer. I expect the machine might have been referring to the following spring. Then there are those new styles of barometers, the long straight ones. I can never make head or tail of those. There's one side for 10 a.m. yesterday, and one side for 10 a.m. today, but you can't get there as early as 10, you know. It rises or falls for rain or fine, and much or less wind, and one is Enley and the other Ellie. What's Ellie got to do with it? And if you tap it, it doesn't tell you anything. And you've got to correct it to sea level, and reduce it to Fahrenheit, and even then I don't know the answer. But who wants to be foretold the weather? It's bad enough when it comes, without our having the misery of knowing about it beforehand. The prophet we like is the old man who, on the particularly gloomy-looking morning of some day, when we particularly want it to be fine, looks round the horizon with a particularly knowing eye and says, "Oh, no, sir. I think it'll clear up all right. It'll break all right enough, sir." "Ah, he knows," we say, and we wish him good morning, and start off, "Wonderful how these old fellows can tell." And we feel an affection for that man which is not at all lessened by the circumstances of it not clearing up, but continuing to rain steadily all day. Ah, well, we feel, he did his best. For the man that prophesies us bad weather, on the contrary, we entertain only bitter and revengeful thoughts. "Going to clear up, do you think?" we shout cheerily as we pass. "Well, no, sir. I'm afraid it's settled down for the day," he replies, shaking his head. "Stupid old fool," we mutter. "What's he know about it?" And if this portent proves correct, we come back feeling still more angry against him, and with a vague notion that, somehow or other, he has had something to do with it. It was too bright and sunny on this especial morning for George's blood-curdling readings about barometer falling, atmospheric disturbance passing in an oblique line over southern Europe, and pressure increasing, to very much upset us. And so, finding that he could not make us wretched, and was only wasting his time, he sneaked the cigarette that I had carefully rolled up for myself, and went. Then, Harris and I, having finished up the few things left on the table, carted out our luggage to the doorstep, and waited for a cab. There seemed a good deal of luggage, when we put it all together. There was the Gladstone and the small handbag, and the 2 hampers and a large roll of rugs, and some 4 or 5 overcoats and mackintoshes, and a few umbrellas, and then there was a melon, by itself in a bag, because it was too bulky to go in anywhere, and a couple of pounds of grapes in another bag, and a Japanese paper umbrella, and a frying pan, which, being too long to pack, we had wrapped round with brown paper. It did look like a lot, and Harris and I began to feel rather ashamed of it, though why we should be I can't see. No cab came by, but the street boys did, and got interested in the show apparently, and stopped. Biggs's boy was the first to come round. Biggs is our greengrocer, and his chief talent lies in securing the services of the most abandoned and unprincipled errand boys that civilization has yet produced. If anything more than usually villainous in the boy line crops up in our neighborhood, we know that it is Biggs's latest. I was told that, at the time of the great Comram Street murder, it was promptly concluded by our street that Biggs's boy, for that period, was at the bottom of it, and had he not been able, in reply to the severe cross-examination to which he was subjected by number 19, when he called there for orders that morning after the crime, assisted by number 21, who happened to be on the step at the time, to prove a complete alibi, it would have gone hard with him. I didn't know Biggs's boy at that time, but from what I have seen of them since, I should not have attached much importance to that alibi myself. Biggs's boy, as I have said, came round the corner. He was evidently in a great hurry when he first dawned upon the vision, but on catching sight of Harris and me and Montmorency and the things, he eased up and stared. Harris and I frowned at him. This might have wounded a more sensitive nature, but Biggs's boys are not, as a rule, touchy. He came to a dead stop, a yard from our step, and leaning against the railings and selecting a straw to chew, fixed us with his eye. He evidently meant to see this thing out. In another moment, the grocer's boy passed on the opposite side of the street. Biggs's boy hailed him. "Hi! Ground floor 42's a-movin'." The grocer's boy came across, and took up a position on the other side of the step. Then the young gentleman from the boot shop stopped, and joined Biggs's boy, while the empty can superintendent from the Blue Posts took up an independent position on the curb. "They ain't a-going to starve, are they?" said the gentleman from the boot shop. "You'd want to take a thing or two with you," retorted the Blue Posts, "if you was a-going across the Atlantic in a small boat." "They ain't a-going across the Atlantic," struck in Biggs's boy. "They're a-going to find Stanley." By this time, quite a small crowd had collected, and the people were asking each other what was the matter. One party, the young and giddy portion of the crowd, held that it was a wedding, and pointed out Harris as the bridegroom, while the elder and more thoughtful among the populace inclined to the idea that it was a funeral, and that I was probably the corpse's brother. At last, an empty cab turned up. It is a street where, as a rule, and when they are not wanted, empty cabs pass at the rate of 3 a minute and hang about and get in your way. And packing ourselves and our belongings into it, and shooting out a couple of Montmorency's friends, who had evidently sworn never to forsake him, we drove away amidst the cheers of the crowd, Biggs's boy shying a carrot after us for luck. We got to Waterloo at 11, and asked where the 11.5 started from. Of course, nobody knew. Nobody at Waterloo ever does know where a train is going to start from, or where a train, when it does start, is going to, or anything about it. The porter who took our things thought it would go from number 2 platform, while another porter, with whom he discussed the question, had heard a rumor that it would go from number 1. The station master, on the other hand, was convinced that it would start from the local. To put an end to the matter, we went upstairs and asked the traffic superintendent, and he told us that he had just met a man who said he had seen it at number 3 platform. We went to number 3 platform, but the authorities there said that they rather thought the train was at the Southampton Express, or else the Windsor Loop. But they were sure it wasn't the Kingston train, though why they were sure it wasn't they could say. Then our porter said he thought it must be on the high-level platform. Said he thought he knew the train. So we went to the high-level platform and saw the engine driver, and asked him if he was going to Kingston. He said he couldn't say for certain, of course, but that he rather thought he was. Anyhow, if he wasn't the 11.5 for Kingston, he said he was pretty confident he was the 9:32 for Virginia Water, or the 10 a.m. express for the Isle of Wight, or somewhere in that direction, and we should all know when we got there. We slipped half a crown into his hand and begged him to be the 11.5 for Kingston. Nobody'll ever know on this line, we said, what you are or where you're going. You know the way. You slip off quietly and go to Kingston. Well, I don't know, gents, replied the noble fellow, but I suppose some train's got to go to Kingston, and I'll do it. Give me the half-crown. Thus, we got to Kingston by the London and South Western Railway. We learned afterwards the train we'd come by was really the Exeter Mail, that they had spent hours at Waterloo looking for it, and nobody knew what had become of it. Our boat was waiting for us at Kingston, just below bridge, and to it we wended our way, and round it we stored our luggage, and into it we stepped. "You all right, sir?" said the man. "Right it is," we answered, and with Harris at the sculls, and I at the tiller lines, and Montmorency, unhappy and deeply suspicious in the prow, out we shot into the waters which, for a fortnight, were to be our home. Chapter 6. Kingston. Instructive remarks on early English history. Instructive observations on carved oak and life in general. Sad case of Stivings, Jr. Musings on antiquity. I forget that I am steering. Interesting result. Hampton Court Maze. Harris as a guide. It was a glorious morning, late spring or early summer, as you care to take it, when the dainty sheen of grass and leaf is blushing to a deeper green, and the year seems like a fair young maid, trembling with strange, wakened pulses on the brink of womanhood. The quaint back streets of Kingston, where they come down to the water's edge, looked quite picturesque on the flashing sunlight, the glinting river with its drifting barges, the wooded towpath, the trim-kept villas on the other side, Harris, in a red and orange blazer, grunting away at the sculls, the distant glimpses of the grey old palace of the Tudors, all made a sunny picture, so bright but calm, so full of life, and yet so peaceful. Early in the day though it was, I felt myself being dreamily lulled off into a musing fit. I mused on Kingston, or Keiningston, as it once called in the days when Saxon kingses were crowned there. Great Caesar crossed the river there, and the Roman legions camped upon its sloping uplands. Caesar, like in later years Elizabeth, seems to have stopped everywhere, only he was more respectable than the good Queen Bess. He didn't put up at the public houses. She was nuts on public houses, was England's Virgin Queen. There's scarcely a pub of any attractions within 10 miles of London that she does not seem to have looked in at or stopped at or slept at some time or other. I wonder now, supposing Harris, say, turned over a new leaf and became a great and good man and got to be prime minister and died, if they would put up signs over the public houses that he had patronized. Harris had a glass of bitter in this house. Harris had 2 of Scotch cold here in the summer of '88. Harris was chucked from here in December 1886. No, there would be too many of them. It would be the houses that he had never entered that would become famous. Only house in South London that Harris never had a drink in. The people would flock to it, see what could have been the matter with it. How poor, weak-minded King Edwy must have hated Kensington. The coronation feast had been too much for him. Maybe boar's head stuffed with sugar plums did not agree with him. Wouldn't with me, I know. And he'd had enough of sack and mead. So he slipped from the noisy revel to steal a quiet moonlight hour with his beloved Elgiva. Perhaps from the casement, standing hand in hand, they were watching the calm moonlight on the river, while from the distant halls the boisterous revelry floated in broken bursts of faint-hearted din and tumult. Then brutal Odo and St. Dunstan forced their rude way into the quiet room and hurl coarse insults at the sweet-faced queen, and drag poor Edwy back to the loud clamor of the drunken brawl. Years later, to the crash of battle music, Saxon kings and Saxon revelry were buried side by side, and Kingston's greatness passed away for a time, to rise once more when Hampton Court became the place of the Tudors and the Stuarts, and the royal barges strained at their moorings on the river's bank, and the bright-cloaked gallants swaggered down the water steps to cry, "What ferry, ho! Gadzooks, gramercy!" Many of the old houses round about speak very plainly of those old days when Kingston was a royal borough, and nobles and courtiers lived there, near their king, and the long road to the palace gates was gay all day with clanking steel and prancing palfreys, and rustling silks and velvets and fair faces. The large and spacious houses, with their oriel, latticed windows, their huge fireplaces, and their gabled roofs, breathe of the days of hose and doublet, of pearl-embroidered stomachers and complicated oaths. They were upraised in the days when men knew how to build. The hard red bricks have only grown more firmly set with time, and their oak stairs do not creak and grunt when you try to go down them quietly. Speaking of oak staircases reminds me that there's a magnificent carved oak staircase in one of the houses in Kingston. It's a shop now, in the marketplace, but it was evidently once the mansion of some great personage. A friend of mine, who lives at Kingston, went in there to buy a hat one day, and, in a thoughtless moment, put his hand in his pocket and paid for it then and there. The shopman, he knows my friend, was naturally a little staggered at first, but quickly recovering himself and feeling that something ought to be done to encourage this sort of thing, asked our hero if he would like to see some fine old carved oak. My friend said he would, and the shopman thereupon took him through the shop and up the staircase of the house. The balusters were a superb piece of workmanship, and the wall all the way up was oak-paneled, with carving that would have done credit to a palace. From the stairs, they went into the drawing-room, which was a large, bright room, decorated with a somewhat startling, though cheerful paper of a blue ground. There was nothing, however, remarkable about the apartment, and my friend wondered why he had been brought there. The proprietor went up to the paper and tapped it. It gave forth a wooden sound. "Oak," he explained. "All carved oak, right up to the ceiling. Just the same as you saw on the staircase." "But, great Caesar, man!" expostulated my friend. "You don't mean to say you've covered over carved oak with blue wallpaper?" "Yes," was the reply. "It was expensive work. Had to match board it all at first, of course, but the room looks cheerful now. It was awful gloomy before." I can't say I altogether blame the man, which is doubtless a great relief to his mind. From his point of view, which would be that of the average householder, desiring to take life as lightly as possible, and not that of the old curiosity shop maniac, there is reason on his side. Carved oak is very pleasant to look at, and to have a little of, but it's no doubt somewhat depressing to live in, for those whose fancy does not lie that way. It would be like living in a church. No, what was sad in his case was that he, who didn't care for carved oak, should have his drawing-room paneled with it, while people who do care for it have to pay enormous prices to get it. It seems to be the rule of this world. Each person has what he doesn't want. The other people have what he does want. Married men have wives and don't seem to want them, and young single fellows cry out that they can't get them. Poor people who can hardly keep themselves have 8 hearty children. Rich old couples with no one to leave their money to die childless. Then there are girls with lovers. The girls that have lovers never want them. They say they would rather be without them. They bother them. Why don't they go make love to Miss Smith and Miss Brown, who are plain and elderly and haven't got any lovers? They themselves don't want lovers. They never mean to marry. It does not do to dwell on these things. It makes one so sad. There was a boy at our school. We used to call him Stanford and Merton. His real name was Stivings. He was the most extraordinary lad I ever came across. I believe he really liked study. He used to get into awful rows for sitting up in bed and reading Greek. And as for French irregular verbs, there was simply no keeping him away from them. He was full of weird and unnatural notions about being a credit to his parents and an honor to the school, and he yearned to win prizes, and grew up to be a clever man, and had all those sorts of weak-minded ideas. I never knew such a strange creature, yet harmless, mind you, as the babe unborn. Well, that boy used to get ill about twice a week, so that he couldn't go to school. There never was such a boy to get ill as that Sanford and Merton. If there was any known disease going within 10 miles of him, he had it, and had it badly. He would take bronchitis in the dog days, and have hay fever at Christmas. After a 6 weeks' period of drought, he would be stricken down with rheumatic fever, and he would go out in a November fog and come home with a sunstroke. They put him under laughing gas one year, poor lad, and drew all his teeth, and gave him a false set, because he suffered so terribly with toothache, and then it turned to neuralgia and earache. He was never without a cold, except once for 9 weeks when he had scarlet fever, and he always had chilblains. During the great cholera scare of 1871, our neighborhood was singularly free from it. There was only one reputed case in the whole parish. That case was young Stivings. He had to stop in bed when he was ill, and eat chicken and custards and hothouse grapes, and he would lie there and sob because they wouldn't let him do Latin exercises and took his German grammar away from him. And we other boys, who would have sacrificed 10 terms of our school life for the sake of being ill for one day, had no desire whatever to give our parents any excuse for being stuck up about us, couldn't catch so much as a stiff neck. We fooled about in draughts, and it did us good and freshened us up, and we took things to make us sick, and they made us fat and gave us an appetite. Nothing we could think of seemed to make us ill until the holidays began. Then, on the breaking up day, we caught colds and whooping cough and all kinds of disorders, which lasted until the term recommenced, when, in spite of everything we could maneuver to the contrary, we would suddenly get well again and be better than ever. Such is life, and we are but grass that is cut down and then put into the oven and baked. To go back to the carved oak question, they must have had very fair notions of the artistic and the beautiful, our great-great-grandfathers. Why, all our art treasures of today are only the dug-up commonplaces of 300 or 400 years ago. I wonder if there's real intrinsic beauty in the old soup plates, beer mugs, and candle snuffers that we prize so now, or if it is only the halo of age glowing around them that gives them their charms in our eyes. The old blue that we hang about our walls as ornaments were common everyday household utensils of a few centuries ago, and the pink shepherds and the yellow shepherdesses that we hand round now for all our friends to gush over and pretend they understand, are the unvalued mantle ornaments that the mother of the 18th century would have given the baby to suck when he cried. Will it be the same in the future? Will the prized treasures of today always be the cheap trifles of the day before? Will rows of our willow-patterned dinner plates be ranged above the chimney places of the great in the years 2000 and odd? Will the white cups with gold rim and the beautiful gold flower inside, the species unknown, that our Sarah Janes now break in sheer light-heartedness of spirit, be carefully mended and stood upon a bracket and dusted only by the lady of the house? that china dog that ornaments the bedroom of my furnished lodgings. It is a white dog, its eyes blue, its nose a delicate red with spots. Its head is painfully erect, its expression is amiability carried to the verge of imbecility. I do not admire it myself. Considered as a work of art, I may say it irritates me. Thoughtless friends jeer at it. Even my landlady herself has no admiration for it, and excuses its presence by the circumstance that her aunt gave it to her. But in 200 years' time, it is more than probable that that dog will be dug up from somewhere or other, minus its legs and with its tail broken, and will be sold for old china and put in a glass cabinet, and people will pass it round and admire it. They will be struck by the wonderful depth of color on the nose, and speculate as to how beautiful the bit of the tail that is lost no doubt was. We in this age do not see the beauty of that dog. We are too familiar with it. It is like the sunset and the stars. We are not awed by the loveliness because they are common in our eyes. So it is with that china dog. In 2288, people will gush over it. The makings of such dogs will become a lost art. Our descendants will wonder how we did it and say how clever we are. We shall be referred to lovingly as those grand old artists that flourished in the 19th century and produced those china dogs. The sampler that the eldest daughter did at school will be spoken of as tapestry of the Victorian era, will be almost priceless. The blue and white mugs of the present-day roadside inn will be hunted up, all cracked and chipped, and sold for their weight in gold, and rich people will use them for claret cups, and travelers from Japan will buy up all the presents from Ramsgate and souvenirs of Margate that may have escaped destruction, and take them back to Jeddo as ancient English curios. At this point, Harris threw away the sculls, got up and left his seat, and sat on his back, and struck his legs in the air. Montmorency howled and turned a somersault, and the top hamper jumped up, and all the things came out. I was somewhat surprised, but I did not lose my temper. I said pleasantly enough, "Hello, what's that for?" "What's that for? Why—" No, on second thought, I will not repeat what Harris said. I may have been to blame, I admit it, but nothing excuses violence of language and coarseness of expression, especially in a man who has been carefully brought up, as I know Harris has been. I was thinking of other things and forgot, as anyone might easily understand, that I was steering. And the consequence was that we had got mixed up a good deal with the towpath. It was difficult to say for the moment which was us and which was the Middlesex bank of the river, but we found out after a while and separated ourselves. Harris, however, said that he had done enough for a bit, and proposed that I should take a turn. So, as we were in, I got out and took the tow line, and ran the boat on past Hampton Court. What a dear old wall that is that runs along by the river there. I never pass it without feeling better for the sight of it. Such a mellow, bright, sweet old wall. What a charming picture it would make, with the lichen creeping here and the moss growing there, a shy young vine peeping up over the top at this spot to see what's going on upon the busy river, and the somber old ivy clustering a little farther down. There are 50 shades and tints and hues in every 10 yards of that old wall. If I could only draw, and knew how to paint, I could make a lovely sketch of that old wall, I'm sure. I've often thought I should like to live at Hampton Court. It looks so peaceful and so quiet, and such a dear old place to ramble round in the early morning before many people are about. But there, I don't suppose I should really care for it when it came to actual practice. It would be so ghastly dull and depressing in the evening, when your lamp cast uncanny shadows on the paneled walls, and the echo of distant feet rang through the cold stone corridors, and now drew nearer, and now died away, and all was death-like silence, save the beating of one's own heart. We are creatures of the sun, we men and women. We love light and life. That is why we crowd into towns and cities, and the country grows more and more deserted every year. In the sunlight, in the daytime, when nature is alive and busy all around us, we like the open hillsides and the deep woods well enough. But in the night, when our Mother Earth has gone to sleep and left us waking, oh, the world seems so lonesome, and we get frightened, like children in a silent house. Then we sit and sob and long for the gaslit streets and the sound of human voices, and the answering throb of human life. We feel so helpless and so little in the great stillness, when the dark trees rustle in the night wind. There are so many ghosts about, and their silent sighs make us feel so sad. Let us gather together in the great cities and light huge bonfires of a million gas jets, and shout and sing together, and feel brave. Harris asked me if I'd ever been in the maze at Hampton Court. He said he went in once to show somebody else the way. He had studied it up in a map, and it was so simple that it seemed foolish, hardly worth the 2 pence charge for admission. Harris said he thought the map must have been got up as a practical joke, because it wasn't a bit like the real thing, and only misleading. It was a country cousin that Harris took in. He said, "We'll just go in here, so that you can say you've been, but it's very simple. It's absurd to call it a maze. You keep on taking the first turning to the right. We'll just walk around for 10 minutes and then go get some lunch." They met some people soon after they'd got inside, who said they'd been in there for 3/4 of an hour, and had had about enough of it. Harris told them they could follow him if they liked. He was just going in and then should turn round and come out again. They said it was very kind of him and fell behind and followed. They picked up various other people who wanted to get it over as they went along, until they absorbed all the persons in the maze. People who had given up all hopes of ever getting either in or out, or of ever seeing their home and friends again, plucked up courage at the sight of Harris and his party, and joined the procession, blessing him. Harris said he should judge there must have been 20 people following him in all, and one woman with a baby, who had been there all morning, insisted on taking his arm for fear of losing him. Harris kept on turning to the right, but it seemed a long way, and his cousin said he supposed it was a very big maze. "Oh, one of the largest in Europe," said Harris. "Yeah, it must be," replied the cousin, "because we've walked a good 2 miles already." Harris began to think it rather strange himself, but he held on until at last they passed the half of the penny bun on the ground that Harris's cousin swore he had noticed there 7 minutes ago. Harris said, "Oh, impossible." But the woman with the baby said, "Not at all," as she herself had taken it from the child and thrown it down there just before she had met Harris. She also added she had wished she never met Harris, and expressed an opinion that he was an impostor. This made Harris mad, and he produced his map and explained his theory. "The map may be all right enough," said one of the party, "if you know whereabouts in it we are now." Harris didn't know, and suggested that the best thing to do would go back to the entrance and begin again. For the beginning again part, there was not much enthusiasm, but with regard to the advisability of going back to the entrance, there was complete unanimity. And so they turned and trailed after Harris again in the opposite direction. About 10 minutes more passed, and they found themselves in the center. Harris thought at first of pretending that it was what he had been aiming at, but the crowd looked dangerous, and he decided to treat it as an accident. Anyhow, they'd got something to start from then. They did know where they were, and the map was once more consulted, and the thing seemed simpler than ever, and off they started for the 3rd time. And 3 minutes later, they were back in the center again. After that, they simply couldn't get anywhere else. Whatever way they turned brought them back to the middle. It became so regular at length that some of the people stopped there, and waited for the others to take a walk round and come back to them. Harris drew out his map again after a while, but the sight of it only infuriated the mob, and they told him to go curl his hair with it. Harris said that he couldn't help feeling that, to a certain extent, he had become unpopular. They all got crazy at last, and sang out for the keeper, and the man came and climbed up the ladder outside, and shouted out directions to them. But all their heads were by this time in such a confused whirl that they were incapable of grasping anything, and so the man told them to stop where they were and he would come to them. They huddled together and waited, and he climbed down and came in. He was a young keeper, as luck would have it, and new to the business, and when he'd got in he couldn't find them, and he wandered about trying to get to them, and then he got lost. They caught sight of him every now and then, rushing about to the other side of the hedge, and he would see them and rush to get them, and they would wait there for about 5 minutes, and then he would reappear again in exactly the same spot, and ask them where they had been. They had to wait till one of the old keepers came back from his dinner before they got out. Harris said he thought it was a very fine maze, so far as he was a judge, and we agreed that we would try to get George to go into it on our way back.
Chapter 7. The river in its Sunday garb, dress on the river, a chance for the men, absence of taste in Harris, George's blazer, a day with the fashion plate young lady, Mrs. Thomas's tomb, the man who loves not graves and coffins and skulls. Harris mad. His views on George and Banks and lemonade. He performs tricks. It was while passing through Molesey Lock that Harris told me about his maze experience. It took us some time to pass through, as we were the only boat and it is a big lock. I don't think I ever remember to have seen Molesey Lock before, with only one boat in it. It is, I suppose, bolters not even excepted, the busiest lock on the river. I have stood and watched it sometimes when you could not see any water at all, but only a brilliant tangle of bright blazers and gay caps and saucy hats and many-colored parasols and silken rugs and cloaks and streaming ribbons and dainty whites. When looking down into the lock from the quay, you might fancy it was a huge box into which flowers of every hue and shade had been thrown pell-mell and lay piled up in a rainbow heap that covered every corner. On a fine Sunday, it presents this appearance nearly all day long, while up the stream and down the stream lie, waiting their turn outside the gates, long lines of still more boats, and boats are drawing near and passing away, so that the sunny river from the palace up to Hampton Church is dotted and decked with yellow and blue and orange and white and red and pink. All the inhabitants of Hampton and Molesey dress themselves up in boating costume and come and mouch around the lock with their dogs and flirt and smoke and watch the boats. And altogether, what with the caps and jackets of the men and pretty-colored dresses of the women, the excited dogs, the moving boats, the white sails, the pleasant landscape, and the sparkling water, it is one of the gayest sights I know of near this dull old London town. The river affords a good opportunity for dress. For once in a way, we men are able to show our taste in colors, and I think we come out very natty, if you ask me. I always like a little red in my things, red and black. You know, my hair is a sort of golden brown, rather a pretty shade, I've been told, and a dark red matches it beautifully. And then I always think a light blue necktie goes so well with it, and a pair of those Russian leather shoes and red silk handkerchief round the waist. A handkerchief looks so much better than a belt. Harris always keeps to shades or mixtures of orange or yellow, but I don't think he is at all wise in this. His complexion is too dark for yellows. Yellows don't suit him. There can be no question about it. I want him to take to blue as a background, with white or cream for relief. But there, the less taste a person has in dress, the more obstinate he always seems to be. It is a great pity, because he will never be a success as it is, while there are one or two colors in which he might not really look so bad, with his hat on. George has bought some new things for this trip, and I'm rather vexed about them. The blazer's loud. I should not like George to know that I thought so, but there really is no other word for it. He brought it home and showed it to us on Thursday evening. We asked him what color he called it. He said he didn't know. He didn't think there was a name for the color. The man had told him it was an Oriental design. George put it on and asked us what we thought of it. Harris said that as an object to hang over a flower bed in early spring to frighten the birds away, he should respect it, but that considered as an article of dress for any human being, it made him ill. George got quite huffy, but as Harris said, if he didn't want his opinion, why did he ask for it? What troubles Harris and myself with regard to it is that we are afraid it will attract attention to the boat. Girls also don't look half bad in a boat, if prettily dressed. Nothing is more fetching, to my thinking, than a tasteful boating costume. But a boating costume, it would be as well if all ladies would understand, ought to be a costume that can be worn in a boat, and not merely under a glass case. It utterly spoils an excursion if you have folk in the boat who are thinking all the time a good deal more of their dress than of the trip. It was my misfortune once to go for a water picnic with two ladies of this kind. We did have a lively time. They were both beautifully got up, all lace and silky stuff and flowers and ribbons and dainty shoes and light gloves, but they were dressed for a photographic studio, not for a river picnic. They were the boating costumes of a French fashion plate. It was ridiculous, fooling about in them anywhere near real earth, air, and water. The first thing was that they thought the boat was not clean. We dusted all the seats for them and then assured them that it was, but they didn't believe us. One of them rubbed the cushion with the forefinger of her glove and showed the result to the other, and they both sighed and sat down with the air of early Christian martyrs trying to make themselves comfortable up against the stake. You are liable to occasionally splash a little when sculling, and it appeared that a drop of water ruined these costumes. The mark never came out, and a stain was left on the dress forever. I was stroke. I did my best. I feathered some 2 feet high, and I paused at the end of each stroke to let the blades drip before returning them, and I picked out a smooch bit of water to drop them into each time again. Bow said after a while that he did not feel himself a sufficiently accomplished oarsman to pull with me, but that he would sit still if I would allow him and study my stroke. He said it interested him. But notwithstanding all this, and try as I would, I could not help an occasional flicker of water from going over those dresses. The girls did not complain, but they huddled up close together and set their lips firm, and every time a drop touched them, they visibly shrank and shuddered. It was a noble sight to see them suffering thus in silence, but it unnerved me altogether. I am too sensitive. I got wild and fitful in my rowing, and splashed more and more the harder I tried not to. I gave it up at last. I said I'd row Bow. Bow thought the arrangement would be better too, and we changed places. The ladies gave an involuntary sigh of relief when they saw me go, and quite brightened up for a moment. Poor girls, they had better have put up with me. The man they had got now was a jolly, light-hearted, thick-headed sort of a chap, with about as much sensitiveness in him as there might be in a Newfoundland puppy. You might look daggers at him for an hour and he would not notice it, and it would not trouble him if he did. He set a good, rollicking, dashing stroke that sent the spray playing all over the boat like a fountain and made the whole crowd sit up straight in no time. When he spread more than a pint of water over one of those dresses, he would give a pleasant little laugh and say, "I beg your pardon, I'm sure," and offer them his handkerchief to wipe it off with. "Oh, it's of no consequence," the poor girls would murmur in reply, and covertly draw rugs and coats over themselves and try to protect themselves with their lace parasols. At lunch, they had a very bad time of it. People wanted them to sit on the grass, and the grass was dusty, and the tree trunks against which they were invited to lean did not appear to have been brushed for weeks. So they spread their handkerchiefs on the ground and sat on those, bolt upright. Somebody, in walking about with a plate of beefsteak pie, tripped over a root and sent the pie flying. None of it went over them, fortunately, but the accident suggested a fresh danger to them and agitated them. And whenever anybody moved about after that, with anything in his hand that could fall and make a mess, they watched that person with growing anxiety until he sat down again. "Now then, you girls," said our friend Bow to them, cheerily, after it was all over, "come along, you've got to wash up." They didn't understand him at first. When they grasped the idea, they said they feared they did not know how to wash up. "Oh, I'll soon show you," he cried. "It's rare fun. You lie down on you lean over the bank, and slouch the things about in the water." The elder sister said that she was afraid that they hadn't got on the dresses suited to the work. "Oh, they'll be all right," he said lightheartedly. "Tuck 'em up." And he made them do it, too. He told them that sort of thing was half the fun of a picnic. They said it was very interesting. Now, I come to think it over. Was that young man as dense-headed as we thought, or was he... No, impossible. There was such a simple, childlike expression about him. Harris wanted to get out at Hampton Church to go and see Mrs. Thomas's tomb. "Who is Mrs. Thomas?" I asked. "How should I know?" replied Harris. "She's a lady that's got a funny tomb, and I want to see it." I objected. I don't know whether it is that I'm built wrong, but I never did seem to hanker after tombstones myself. I know that the proper thing to do when you get to a village or town is to rush off to the churchyard and enjoy the graves, but it is a recreation that I always deny myself. I take no interest in creeping round dim and chilly churches behind wheezy old men and reading epitaphs. Not even the sight of a bit of cracked brass let into a stone affords me what I call real happiness. I shock respectable sextons by the imperturbability I am able to assume before exciting inscriptions, and by my lack of enthusiasm for the local family history. while my ill-concealed anxiety to get outside wounds their feelings. One golden morning of a sunny day, I leaned against the low stone of a wall that guarded a little village church, and I smoked and drank in deep, calm gladness from the sweet, restful scene. The gray old church with its clustering ivy and its quaint carved wooden porch, the white lane winding down the hill between the tall rows of elms, the thatched roof cottages peeping above their trim-kept hedges, the silver river in the hollow, the wooded hills beyond. It was a lovely landscape. It was idyllic, poetical, and it inspired me. I felt good and noble. I felt I didn't want to be sinful and wicked anymore. I would come and live here and never do any more wrong and lead a blameless, beautiful life and have silver hair when I got old and all that sort of thing. In that moment, I forgave all my friends and relations for their wickedness and cursedness, and I blessed them. They did not know that I blessed them. They went their abandoned way, all unconscious of what I, far away in that peaceful village, was doing for them. But I did it, and I wish that I could let them know that I had done it, because I wanted to make them happy. I was going on thinking away all these grand, tender thoughts, when my reverie was broken in upon by a shrill, piping voice crying out, "All right, sir, I'm a-coming. It's all right, sir, don't you be in a hurry." I looked up and saw an old, bald-headed man hobbling across the churchyard towards me, carrying a huge bunch of keys in his hand that shook and jingled at every step. I motioned him away with a silent dignity, but he still advanced, screeching out the while, "I'm a-comin', sir, I'm a-comin'. I'm a little lame, I ain't as spry as I used to be. This way, sir." "Go away, you miserable old man," I said. "I've come as soon as I could, sir," he replied. "My missus never see you till just this minute. You follow me, sir." "Go away," I repeated. "Leave me before I get over the wall and slay you." He seemed surprised. "Don't you want to see the tombs?" he said. "No," I answered, "I don't. I want to stop here, leaning up against this gritty old wall. Go away and don't disturb me. I am chock full of beautiful and noble thoughts, and I want to stop like it, because it feels nice and good. Don't you come fooling about making me mad, shivering away all my better feelings with this silly tombstone nonsense of yours. Go away and get somebody to bury you cheap, and I'll pay half the expense." He was bewildered for a moment. He rubbed his eyes and looked hard at me. I seemed human enough on the outside. He couldn't make it out. He said, "You's a stranger in these parts. You don't live here?" "No," I said, "I don't. You wouldn't if I did." "Well, then," he said, "you want to see the tombs, graves, folks been buried, coffins." "You are an untruther," I replied, getting roused. "I do not want to see tombs, not your tombs." "Why should I? We have graves of our own, our family has. Why, my Uncle Podger has a tomb in Kensal Green Cemetery that is the pride of all the countryside, and my grandfather's vault at Bow is capable of accommodating 8 visitors, while my great-aunt Susan has a brick grave in Finchley Churchyard with a headstone with a coffee pot sort of thing in the bas-relief upon it, and a 6-inch best white stone coping all the way around that costs pounds. When I want graves, it is to see those places that I go and revel. I do not want other folks. When you yourself are buried, I will come and see yours. That is all I can do for you." He burst into tears. He said that one of the tombs had a bit of stone upon the top of it that had been said by some to be probably part of the remains of the figure of a man, and that another had some words carved upon it that nobody had ever been able to decipher. I still remained obdurate, and in broken-hearted tones he said, "Well, won't you come and see the memorial window?" I would not even see that. So he fired his last shot. He drew near and whispered hoarsely, "I've got a couple of skulls down in the crypt," he said. "Come and see those. Oh, do come and see the skulls. You are a young man out for a holiday and you want to enjoy yourself. Come and see the skulls." Then I turned and fled, and as I sped, I heard him calling to me, "Oh, come and see the skulls! Come back and see the skulls!" Harris, however, revels in tombs and graves, and epitaphs and monumental inscriptions, and the thought of not seeing Mrs. Thomas's grave made him crazy. He said that he had looked forward to seeing Mrs. Thomas's grave from the first moment that the trip was proposed, said he wouldn't have joined it if it hadn't been for the idea of seeing Mrs. Thomas's tomb. I reminded him of George and how we had to get the boat up to Shepperton by 5 o'clock to meet him, and then he went for George. Why was George to fool about all day and leave us to lug this lumbering, old, top-heavy barge up and down the river by ourselves to meet him? Why couldn't George come and do some work? Why couldn't he have got the day off and come down with us? Bank be blowed. What good was he at the bank? I've never seen him do any work there, Harris continued. Whenever I go in, he sits behind a bit of glass all day trying to look as if he was doing something. What's the good of a man behind a bit of glass? I have to work for my living. Why can't he work? What use is he there? And what's the good of their banks? They take our money, and then when you draw a check, they send it back smeared all over with no effects, refer to drawer. What's the good of that? That's the sort of trick they served me twice last week. I'm not going to stand it much longer. I shall withdraw my account. If he was here, we would go and see that tomb. I don't believe he's at the bank at all. He's larking about somewhere. That's what he's doing, leaving us to do all the work. I'm going to get out and have a drink. I pointed out to him that we were miles away from a pub, and then he went on about the river and what was the good of the river, and was everyone who came on the river to die of thirst. It is always best to let Harris have his head when he gets like this. Then he pumps himself out and is quiet afterwards. I reminded him that there was a concentrated lemonade in the hamper and a gallon jar of water in the nose of the boat, and that the two only wanted mixing to make a cool and refreshing beverage. Then he flew off about lemonade and such like Sunday school slops, as he termed them, ginger beer, raspberry syrup, etc., etc. He said they all produced dyspepsia and ruined the body and soul alike, and were the cause of half the crime in England. He said he must drink something, however, and climbed upon the seat and leant over to get the bottle. It was right at the bottom of the hamper and seemed difficult to find, and he had to lean over further and further, and in trying to steer at the same time from a topsy-turvy point of view, he pulled the wrong line and sent the boat into the bank, and the shock upset him, and he dived down right into the hamper and stood there on his head, holding onto the sides of the boat like grim death, his legs kicking and sticking up into the air. He dared not move for fear of going over, and had to stay there till I could get hold of his legs and haul him back, and that made him madder than ever. Chapter 8. Blackmailing. The proper course to pursue. Selfish boorishness of riverside landover. Notice boards. Unchristian-like feelings of Harris. How Harris sings a comic song. A high-class party. Shameful conduct of two abandoned young men. Some useless information. George buys a banjo. We stopped under the willows by Kempton Park and lunched. It is a pretty little spot there, a pleasant grass plateau running alongside the water's edge and overhung by willows. We had just commenced the third course, the bread and jam, when a gentleman in shirt sleeves and a short pipe came along and wanted to know if we knew that we were trespassing. We said we hadn't given the matter sufficient consideration as to yet enable us to arrive at a definite conclusion on that point, but that if he assured us on his word as a gentleman that we were trespassing, we would, without further hesitation, believe it. He gave us the required assurance, and we thanked him, but he still hung about and deemed to be dissatisfied, so we asked him if there was anything further that we could do for him, and Harris, who is of a chummy disposition, offered him a bit of bread and jam. I fancy he must have belonged to some society sworn to abstain from bread and jam, for he declined it quite gruffly, as if he were vexed at being tempted with it, and he added that it was his duty to turn us off. Harris said that if it was his duty, it ought to be done, and asked the man what was his idea with regard to the best means for accomplishing it. Harris is what you would call a well-made man of about No. 1 size, and looks hard and bony, and the man measured him up and down and said he would go and consult his master, and then come back and chuck us both into the river. Of course, we never saw him any more, and, of course, all he really wanted was a shilling. There are a certain number of riverside roughs who make quite an income during the summer by slouching about the banks and blackmailing weak-minded noodles in this way. They represent themselves as sent by the proprietor. The proper course to pursue is to offer your name and address, and leave to the owner, if he really has anything to do with the matter, to summon you and prove what damage you have done to his land by sitting down on a bit of it. But the majority of people are so intensely lazy and timid that they prefer to encourage the imposition by giving in to it rather than to put an end to it by the exertion of a little firmness. Where it is really the owners that are to blame, they ought to be shown up. The selfishness of the riparian proprietor grows with every year. If these men had their way, they would close the river Thames altogether. They actually do this along the minor tributary streams and in the backwaters. They drive posts into the bed of the stream and draw chains across from bank to bank and nail huge notice boards on every tree. The sight of those notice boards rouses every evil instinct in my nature. I feel I want to tear each one down and hammer it over the head of the man who put it up until I have killed him, and then I would bury him and put the board up over the grave as a tombstone. I mentioned these feelings of mine to Harris, and he said that he had them worse than that. He said he had not only felt he wanted to kill the man who caused the board to be put up, but that he should like to slaughter the whole of his family and all his friends and relations and then burn down his house. This seemed to me to be going too far, and I said so to Harris. But he answered, "Not a bit of it. Serve 'em all jolly well right, and I'd go and sing comic songs on the ruins." I was vexed to hear Harris go on in this bloodthirsty strain. We never ought to allow our instincts of justice to degenerate into mere vindictiveness. It was a long while before I could get Harris to take a more Christian view of the subject, but I succeeded at last, and he promised me that he would spare the friends and relations at all events and would not sing comic songs on the ruins. You have never heard Harris sing a comic song, or you would understand the service I had rendered to mankind. It is one of Harris's fixed ideas that he can sing a comic song. The fixed idea, on the contrary, among those of Harris's friends who have heard him try, is that he can't and never will be able to, and that he ought not to be allowed to try. When Harris is at a party and is asked to sing, he replies, "Well, I can only sing a comic song, you know." And he says it in the tone that implies that his singing of that, however, is a thing that you ought to hear once and then die. "Oh, that is nice," says the hostess. "Do sing one, Mr. Harris." And Harris gets up and makes for the piano with the beaming cheeriness of a generous-minded man who is about to give somebody something. "Now silence, please, everybody," says the hostess, turning around. "Mr. Harris is going to sing a comic song." "Oh, how jolly," they murmur, and they hurry in from the conservatory and come up the stairs and go and fetch each other from all over the house and crowd into the drawing room and sit around all smirking in anticipation. Then Harris begins. "Well, you don't look for much of a voice in a comic song. You don't expect correct phrasing or vocalization. You don't mind if a man does find out when in the middle of a note that he is too high and comes down with a jerk. You don't bother about time. You don't mind a man being 2 bars in front of the accompaniment and easing up in the middle of a line to argue it out with the pianist and then starting the verse afresh. But you do expect the words. You don't expect a man to never remember more than the first 3 lines of the first verse and to keep on repeating these lines until it is time to begin the chorus. You don't expect a man to break off in the middle of a line and snigger and say it's very funny, but he's blessed if he can think of the rest of it, and then try and make it up for himself, and afterwards suddenly recollect it, and when he has got to an entirely different part of the song and break off without a word of warning, to go back and let you have it then and there. You don't, well, I will just give you an idea of Harris's comic singing, and then you can judge for yourself. Harris, standing up in front of a piano and addressing the expectant mob. I'm afraid it's a very old thing, you know. I expect you all to know it, you know, but it's the only thing I know. It's the judge's song out of Pinafore. No, I don't mean Pinafore. I mean, you know what I mean, the other thing, you know. You must all join the chorus, you know. Murmurs of delight and anxiety to join in the chorus. Brilliant performance of prelude to the judge's song in Trial by Jury by nervous pianist. Moment arrives for Harris to join in. Harris takes no notice of it. Nervous pianist commences prelude over again, and Harris, commencing singing at the same time, dashes off the first two lines of the First Lord's song out of a pinafore. Nervous pianist tries to push on with prelude, gives it up, and tries to follow Harris with accompaniment to Judge's song out of Trial by Jury. Finds that doesn't answer, and tries to recollect what he is doing and where he is, feels his mind giving way, and stops short. Harris, with kindly encouragement. It's all right, you're doing it very well indeed. Go on. Nervous pianist. I'm afraid there's a mistake somewhere. Oh, what are you singing? Harris, promptly. Why, the Judge's song out of Trial by Jury, don't you know it? Some friend of Harris's from the back of the room. No, you're not, you chucklehead. You're singing the Admiral's song from Pinafore. Long argument between Harris and Harris's friend as to what Harris is really singing. Friend finally suggests that it doesn't matter what Harris is singing so long as Harris gets on it and sings it, and Harris, with an evident sense of injustice rankling inside him, requests pianist to begin again. Pianist thereupon starts prelude to the Admiral song, and Harris, seizing what he considers to be a favorable opening in the music, begins. Harris. When I was young and called to the bar. A general roar of laughter, taken by Harris as a compliment. Pianist, thinking of his wife and family, gives up the unequal contest and retires, his place being taken by a stronger nerved man. The new pianist, cheerily. Now then, old man, you start off and I'll follow. We won't bother about any prelude. Harris, upon whom the explanation of matters has slowly dawned, laughing. Ha! By Jove! I beg your pardon, of course I've been mixing up the two songs. It was Jenkins confused me, you know. Now then. Singing, his voice appearing to come from the cellar and suggesting the first low warnings of an approaching earthquake. When I was young, I served a term as office boy to an attorney's firm. Aside to pianist. It's too low, old man. We'll have to go over that again, if you don't mind. He sings the first two lines over again, in a high falsetto this time. Great surprise on the part of the audience. Nervous old lady near the fire begins to cry and has to be let out. Harris, continuing. I swept the windows and I swept the door and I... No, I cleaned the windows of the big front door and I polished up the floor. No, dash it. I beg your pardon. Funny thing, I can't think of that line. And I... Oh well, we'll get on the chorus and chance it. He sings. And I diddle 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 dee till now I'm the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Now then, the chorus, it is the last two lines repeated, you know? And then the general chorus. And he diddle 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 dee till now he's the ruler of the Queen's Navy. And Harris never sees what an ass he is making of himself and how he's annoying a lot of people who never did him any harm. He honestly imagines that he has given them a treat and says he will sing another comic song after supper. Speaking of comic songs and parties, reminds me of a rather curious incident at which I once assisted, which, as it throws much light upon the inner mental working of human nature in general, ought, I think, to be recorded in these pages. We were a fashionable and highly cultured party. We had on our best clothes, and we talked pretty, and were very happy, all except two young fellows, students, just returned from Germany, commonplace young men who seemed restless and uncomfortable, as if they found the proceedings slow. The truth was we were too clever for them. Our brilliant but polished conversation and our high-class tastes were beyond them. They were out of place among us, and they never ought to have been there at all. Everybody agreed upon that later on. We played morceau from the old German masters. We discussed philosophy and ethics. We flirted with graceful dignity. We were even humorous, in a high-class way. Somebody recited a French poem after supper, and we said it was beautiful. And then a lady sang a sentimental ballad in Spanish, and it made one or two of us weep. It was so pathetic. And then those two young men got up and asked us if we had ever heard Herr Slolsenboschen, who had just arrived and was then down in the supper room, sing his great German comic song. None of us had heard it that we could remember. The young men said it was the funniest song that had ever been written, and that, if we liked, they would go get Herr Slolsenboschen, whom they knew very well, to sing it. They said it was so funny that when Herr Slolsenboschen had sung it once before the German emperor, he, the German emperor, had to be carried off to bed. They said nobody could sing it like Herr Schlossen Boschen. He was so intensely serious all through it that you might fancy he was reciting a tragedy, and that, of course, made it all the funnier. They said he never once suggested by his tone or manner that he was singing anything funny. That would spoil it. It was his air of seriousness, almost of pathos, that made it so irresistibly amusing. We said we yearned to hear it, that we wanted a good laugh, and they went downstairs and fetched Herr Schlossen Boschen. He appeared to be quite pleased to sing it, for he came up at once and sat down to the piano without another word. "Oh, it will amuse you. You will laugh," whispered the two young men as they passed through the room and took up an unobtrusive position behind the professor's back. Herr Schlossen Boschen accompanied himself. The prelude did not suggest a comic song exactly. It was a weird, soulful air. It quite made one's flesh creep, but we murmured to one another that it was the German method and prepared to enjoy it. I don't understand German myself. I learned it at school but forgot every word of it 2 years after I had left, and have felt much better ever since. Still, I do not want the people there to guess my ignorance, so I hit upon what I thought to be a rather good idea. I kept my eye on the two young students and followed them. When they tittered, I tittered. When they roared, I roared. I also threw in a little snigger all by myself now and then, as if I had seen a bit of humor that had escaped the others. I considered this particularly artful on my part. I noticed, as the song progressed, that a good many other people seemed to have their eye fixed on the two young men as well as myself. These other people also tittered when the young men tittered, and roared when the young men roared, and as the two young men tittered and roared and exploded with laughter pretty continuously all through the song, it went exceedingly well. And yet that German professor did not seem happy. At first, when we began to laugh, the expression on his face was of intense surprise, as if laughter were the very last thing he expected to be greeted with. We thought this very funny. We said his earnest manner was half the humor. The slightest hint on his part that he knew how funny he was would have completely ruined it all. As we continued to laugh, his surprise gave way to an air of annoyance and indignation, and he scowled fiercely round upon us all, except upon the two young men who, being behind him, he could not see. That sent us into convulsions. We told each other that it would be the death of us, this thing. The words alone, we said, were enough to send us into fits, but added to his mock seriousness. Oh, it was just too much. In the last verse, he surpassed himself. He glowered round upon us with a look of such concentrated ferocity, but for our being forewarned as to the German method of comic singing, we should have been nervous. And he threw such a wailing note of agony into the weird music. If we had not known it was a funny song, we might have wept. He finished amid a perfect shriek of laughter. We said it was the funniest thing we had ever heard in all our lives. We said how strange it was that, in the face of things like these, there should be a popular notion that the Germans hadn't any sense of humor, and we asked the professor why he didn't translate the song into English so that the common people could understand it and hear what a real comic song was like. Then, Herr Schlossen Boschen got up and went on awful. He swore at us in German, which I should judge to be a singularly effective language for that purpose, and he danced and shook his fists and called us all the English he knew. He said he had never been so insulted in all his life. It appeared that the song was not a comic song at all. It was about a young girl who lived in the Harz Mountains and who had given up her life to save her lover's soul, and he died and met her spirit in the air, and then, in the last verse, he jilted her spirit and went on with another spirit. I'm not quite sure of the details, but it was something very sad, I know. Herr Boschen said he had sung it once before the German emperor, and he, the German emperor, had sobbed like a little child. He, Herr Boschen, said it was generally acknowledged to be one of the most tragic and pathetic songs in the German language. It was a trying situation for us. Very trying. There seemed to be no answer. We looked around for these two young men who had done this thing, but they had left the house in an unostentatious manner immediately after the end of the song. That was the end of the party. I never saw a party break up so quietly, with so little fuss. We never said good night even to one another. We came downstairs one at a time, walking softly and keeping the shady side. We asked the servant for our hats and coats in whispers and opened the door for ourselves and slipped out and got round the corner quickly, avoiding each other as much as possible. I have never taken much interest in German songs since then. We reached Sunbury Lock at 3:30. The river is sweetly pretty just there before you come to the gates, and the backwater is charming, but don't attempt to row up it. I tried to do so once. I was sculling and asked the fellows who were steering if they thought it could be done, and they said, oh yes, they thought so, if I pulled hard. We were just under the little footbridge that crosses it between the two weirs when they said this, and I bent down over the sculls and set myself up and pulled. I pulled splendidly. I got well into a steady, rhythmical swing. I put my arms and my legs and my back into it. I set myself a good, quick, dashing stroke and worked in really grand style. My two friends said it was a pleasure to watch me. At the end of 5 minutes, I thought we ought to be pretty near the weir, and I looked up. We were under the bridge in exactly the same spot that we were when I began, and there were those two idiots injuring themselves by violent laughing. I had been grinding away like mad to keep the boat stuck still under that bridge. I let other people pull up backwaters against the strong streams now. We sculled up to Walton, a rather large place for a riverside. As with all riverside places, only the tiniest corner of it comes down to the water, so that from the boat you might fancy it was a village of some 6 houses all told. Windsor and Abingdon are the only towns between London and Oxford that you can really see anything of from the stream. All the others hide round corners and merely peep at the river down one street. My thanks to them for being so considerate and leaving the river banks to woods and fields and waterworks. Even Reading, though, does its best to spoil and sully and make hideous as much of the river as it can reach, is good-natured enough to keep its ugly face a good deal out of sight. Caesar, of course, had a little place at Walton, a camp or an entrenchment or something of that sort. Caesar was a regular upriver man. Also Queen Elizabeth, she was there too. You can never get away from that woman, go where you will. Cromwell and Bradshaw, not the guide man, but the King Charles head man, likewise sojourned here. They must have been quite a pleasant little party altogether. There is an iron scold's bridle in Walton Church. They used these things in ancient days for curbing women's tongues. They have given up the attempt now. I suppose iron was getting scarce, and nothing else would be strong enough. There are also tombs of note in the church, and I was afraid I should never get Harris past them, but he didn't seem to think of them, and we went on. Above the bridge, the river winds tremendously. This makes it look picturesque, but it irritates you from a towing or sculling point of view and causes argument between the man who is pulling and the man who is steering. You pass Oatlands Park on the right bank here. It is a famous old place. Henry VIII stole it from someone or the other, I forget whom now, and lived in it. There is a grotto in the park, which you can see for a fee, and which is supposed to be very wonderful, but I cannot see much in it myself. The late Duchess of York, who lived at Oatlands, was very fond of dogs, and kept an immense number. She had a special graveyard made in which to bury them, and when they died, and there they lie, about 50 of them, with a tombstone over each and an epitaph inscribed thereon. Well, I dare say they deserve it quite as much as the average Christian does. At Corway Stakes, the first bend above Walton Bridge, was fought a battle between Caesar and Cassivellaunus. Cassivellaunus had prepared the river for Caesar by planting it full of stakes, and had, no doubt, put up a notice board. But Caesar crossed in spite of this. You couldn't choke Caesar off that river. He is the sort of man we want round the backwaters now. Halliford and Shepperton are both pretty little spots where they touch the river, but there is nothing remarkable about either of them. There is a tomb in Shepperton churchyard, however, with a poem on it, and I was nervous lest Harris should want to go out and fool around it. I saw him fix a longing eye on the landing stage as we drew near it, so I managed, by an adroit movement, to jerk his cap into the water, and in the excitement of recovering that, and his indignation at my clumsiness, he forgot all about his beloved graves. At Weybridge, the Wey, a pretty little stream navigable for small boats up to Guildford, and one which I have always been making up my mind to explore and never have, the Bourne and the Basing-Stoke Canal all enter the Thames together. The lock is just opposite the town, and the first thing that we saw when we came in view of it was George's blazer on one of the lock gates, closer inspection showing that George was inside it. Montmorency set up a furious barking. I shrieked, Harris roared. George waved his hat and yelled back. The lock-keeper rushed out with a drag, under the impression that somebody had fallen into the lock, and appeared annoyed at finding that no one had. George had a rather curious oilskin-covered parcel in his hand. It was round and flat at one end, with a long, straight handle sticking out of it. "What's that?" said Harris. "A frying pan?" "No," said George with a strange, wild, glittering look in his eye. "They are all the rage this season. Everybody has got them upriver. It's a banjo." "I never knew you played the banjo," cried Harris and I in one breath. "Not exactly," replied George, "but it's very easy, they tell me, and I've got the instruction book." You've been listening to Classics You Slept Through's second installment of 3 Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog, by Jerome K. Jerome. Stick with us for the next episode when we discuss this reading. Peace.